Welcome, everyone, to the November Beyond the Algorithm Reading Club. I'm Kari Weaver. I'm the Program Manager, Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning with the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And it's my delight today to welcome our guest expert, Dani Dilkes. Dani is an educational developer with the Center for Teaching and Learning, CTL, at Western University. She specializes in digital pedagogy, accessibility, and approaches to inclusive teaching and learning. She's also currently a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, researching futures of higher education and how to shape them to be more inclusive in times of great disruption, including the emergence of new technologies like generative artificial intelligence. Dani leads the Gen AI programming for the CTL and has approached this holistically by balancing technological, pedagogical, ethical, and affective considerations of generative artificial intelligence use. Dani, thanks so much for joining me today for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, Kari. I'm really excited to chat through some of these considerations.
Absolutely. So to get us started off, could you tell us how might your personal values, such as equity, access, or innovation, influence your stance on supporting or limiting the use of generative artificial intelligence tools in higher education and instruction?
So I think values really do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of how we respond to generative AI. They play a huge role in shaping how you engage with or choose not to engage with generative AI tools in higher education. They impact how we make decisions, what we prioritize or what we focus on, and just generally how we move through the world. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, values might impact our perceptions of artificial intelligence. It might impact what affordances or harms are most important to us. So where we sort of fixate our attention when we're thinking about these tools. Um, and I guess as an example, one of my key values is honoring diversity or uniqueness. A lot of my academic work and a lot of my professional work focuses on challenging social designs and educational designs that push individuals towards a sameness. So for me, the use of artificial intelligence to produce text is actually really concerning because I find it can flatten unique voices, shifting them towards what is literally a statistical norm and these kind of normative patterns. As someone who is neurodivergent, I have a fairly unique relationship to and use of both language and words. So I notice immediately when my ideas are stripped of my own unique or weird, wonderfully weird voice. So this means that for me, using AI for writing, particularly writing where authenticity matters to me, is not going to be a practice that I'll likely adopt. However, on the flip side of that, I'm also deeply curious and inquisitive. Curiosity is one of my key values. So I will get into rabbit hole conversations with generative AI chatbots, um, just to see what might happen, to see where the conversation leads. And these conversations might not be directly related to any task or thing I'm trying to work on, but just exploratory and weird conversations to see how the large language model will respond to the things that I'm prompting it with. So it's not necessarily that I don't use AI or generative AI. I very much do. It's part of my role. I'm just very cautious about outsourcing my voice to it or treating its responses with anything less than skepticism. Um, Going beyond sort of my own values, for others who prioritize other values, their stance on generative AI adoption will be drastically different than how I'm approaching it. And I think we need to leave room in the conversation for that difference in values. For example, someone who places a high level of importance on productivity or efficiency might use these tools to increase output in a shorter amount of time. Somebody who values transparency might really struggle with any use of these tools because they function in a black box. We don't really know how they work. We never really understand how a response is being generated or what patterns are informing that response. I do think it's really important, though, to be cautious to not oversimplify how values impact our use, because it's rarely a direct correlation between a value and a practice. Someone who values relationships and authenticity might opt to never use generative AI in communication in order to maintain their own voice and foster human-to-human connection. Or they may choose to use generative AI to complete mundane tasks more quickly, to allow them more free time to foster relationships away from the workplace, away from their computers, out in the community. Someone else who values creativity may incorporate these tools into their creative process and that becomes part of their like artistic practice, but others may view them as deeply conflicting with the idea of human creativity. So as with all things, there is a very deep complexity to how values impact adoption and perception of generative AI tools. And I think it's,
Absolutely.
oh, sorry, Kari.
No, I was just going to say absolutely. And I think that that's really interesting. And I think many of our listeners will find that very compelling, because they're themselves struggling to think about where they stand and how they can approach generative artificial intelligence when they're, in many cases, receiving messages from the larger higher education sector or from their institutions, or maybe even leadership within their library itself, that is really saying, Gen AI can be a productivity tool. Gen AI may allow us to do work that we couldn't do previously. And certainly in times of fiscal conservatism that we are experiencing, particularly here in higher education in Ontario, there absolutely are driving forces that maybe at times are aligned, but at other times are in opposition to personal values that we might hold. Um, So with that, I think that's actually a perfect time to talk a little bit about values friction. Um, could you talk to me a touch about what ways values friction between those institutional policies and personal beliefs might affect decision making around AI tool adoption in higher education, and how these tensions can be constructively addressed?
So I think the interesting thing with even understanding values friction is sort of first revealing, like making visible the values that are shaping policy, that are shaping even how generative artificial intelligence companies are developing tools and how they're advertising tools, and then shaping our own reactions to them. When values friction occurs between individuals and larger entities, like higher education institutions, or even these tech companies that control AI development and to some degree the regulation of AI, there can be a significant impact on how individuals both adopt and perceive these tools. Lately in the news, there have been a lot of examples where tech companies have prioritized their business goals, their business values, such as increasing their user bases or increasing revenue. Some of these values we might similarly see at higher levels of the institution. And these decisions have been shown to be to the detriment of the actual well-being of the users of these tools. For example, OpenAI released a model which they quickly recalled that demonstrated extreme sycophancy. It just was like flattering users and telling users that everything they said was right and brilliant and the best, which, as you can imagine, was quite harmful to the actual interactions because it didn't really result in any sort of critical dialogue, to whatever degree that might be possible otherwise. Most of these models are actually designed to overly flatter or praise users because it keeps those users coming back. So it keeps them subscribing to that same service. And this can have all sorts of other repercussions, creating echo chambers, flaming egos, resulting in concerning trends around how humans are actually forming connections with these technologies. Recent court cases have similarly provided examples of instances where these tools have prioritized interactions that keep users engaged, keep users coming back, over the actual mental health of these users to ensure that subscribers are not lost. And in some cases, this has had very tragic results. And these companies may also value progress or rapid innovation over ethics or safety. So we see that friction between this like progress narrative, and how do we do this in a way that will reduce harm, this can result in updates of these systems not being fully tested, needing to be pulled back or recalled very quickly because they demonstrated concerning behavior that the companies didn't really take the time to fully engage with. So when we think sort of down a level, sort of at the institutions such as universities or colleges, the friction that occurs may not be as explicit, and it may not be specifically about how AI is perceived, or to overuse the term, how it's valued at the institution. But the overall values of higher education might create the conditions to make certain uses of generative AI more or less likely. So for example, in many ways, higher education and curriculum is often positioned as a means to an end, getting a particular job or earning a certain salary at the end of your degree. And this sort of instrumentalization of the educational process de-emphasizes learning, turning education into kind of a form of product generation. We really just care about what happens at the end. And this is something that AI tools are really good at. They can produce very, very well. They're not so good at that sort of engaged process of learning. And one of the big concerns with AI in the education landscape right now that is very vocal in kind of media outlets and conversations is the potential for learning loss. But I think that it's really the values of the institution, the culture and climate of education that's pushing learners to adopt these tools as much as it is the availability of the tools themselves. And this might actually kind of deviate a little bit from values friction to how certain values are taught through these education narratives and how generative AI tools are positioned in those narratives and sort of enforcing certain values as the ones that people should be focusing on, like productivity or like innovation. And possibly the overly positive hype around generative AI is teaching users to value these things: productivity over mindfulness, speed over slowness, product over process. And I think that's where we really do need to be sort of focusing our attention. Our responsibility as educators is to remember our values, to try and stay true to our values, and to be cautious of these concessions that we make and that our institutions maybe are encouraging us to make that may conflict with those values. And I would say that means that we need to stay informed ourselves on both the potential and risks of generative AI tools, engage in constructive conversation with others to make more potential or more visible the potential impact of certain uses. So for me, I would say transparency and reflection are really key. I also think that, and I've probably said this a few times now, we do need to advocate for policies that allow for multiple perspectives, for a variety of values, and for individual agency to choose if or how to use these tools.
Yeah, so I think that is so fascinating, and you can certainly, I think, feel for the library workers listening, um, that there really is a lot of values friction that we're experiencing in our work. And that seems to be sort of a microcosm of the larger values friction that people are experiencing just within the higher education space, which is somewhat unsurprising in that academic library work tends to be kind of a microcosm of that larger ecosystem. But one of the things that is, I think, really a challenge for us as library workers is that many of the tools and technologies used in academic libraries are vendor supplied and currently actively integrating artificial intelligence. So, how could academic librarians and library workers manage the values friction in a context where AI will fairly shortly be present in their tools and workflows if it hasn't already arrived?
This is such a challenging but also really interesting question because generative AI is being embedded in all sorts of places, both visibly and invisibly. It's sort of akin to, I don't know, maybe a decade ago where suddenly everything had Bluetooth, like your Bluetooth fridge, your Bluetooth toilet. And we're sort of seeing that same thing with generative AI, often in places where it doesn't make sense. But admittedly, it is making it increasingly difficult to avoid. And often it might be embedded in tools that we have to use for our jobs, for our studies, for the social practices that we've already sort of have developed or have. So it can make it feel like we no longer have agency to refuse or resist use. But I think there is a danger in equating ubiquity with a lack of agency. So yes, it might be everywhere, but in a lot of these cases, we still maintain the ability to choose to ignore it. And it can be a lot more work to ignore it, but I would say at the moment, it's not necessarily impossible to resist or refuse if that's what aligns with our values. In many cases, AI add-ons can be ignored. So in Google, it now generates an AI overview at the top of the screen, but you can choose to scroll past it and still use kind of Google search results in the way that we've always been accustomed to. Admittedly, it's not always easy. I often find myself sucked in by the very convenient AI overview before I remind myself that I need to kind of go down, drill down, look at like valuable sources. Similarly, in Adobe, you can ignore or even turn off the AI generated summary that it produces. So I would say our first line is to understand where these tools are now appearing and how they function, which might not always be the easiest thing to determine. But once we're able to decide if they are or are not useful for whatever our workflows or our tasks are, then we can engage in deliberate and intentional use or avoidance where possible. For example, force yourself to keep scrolling past the AI overview or click off the convenient summary. As of yet, I've not seen a place where an AI add-in has replaced other functionality in a system. So typically you can still do all the things you've done. It's just sort of been added in, although that might not always be the case. But in these cases, individuals may not have the power to outright refuse to use a tool where AI has been added, but they can still either avoid use and kind of build workflows around those tools, and they still have the power to voice concerns and potentially sway licensing decisions if it does become such a great concern that they would like to kind of eliminate that tool entirely from their workflows, from their workplace.
And certainly considering licensing, because a lot of our licensing here in Ontario happens through OCL, and the impacts of artificial intelligence on licensing is absolutely something that we're considering at the consortial and provincial level. But we also recognize we're a somewhat small market for a lot of our major publishers. And so even though combining our efforts through consortial purchasing is both fiscally responsible and gives us a little bit more power in those conversations around licensing issues, um, we we know from our past experiences related to other issues around licensing that it's always a complex process to engage in those conversations with our vendors. But I really appreciate that perspective, Dani, and I think that that is really helpful for a lot of the librarians and library workers out there who maybe are looking at and feel a lack of uncertainty or feel like the inclusion of artificial intelligence and a lot of these vendor supplied tools is really not supporting the work that they do, and is maybe just kind of an additional thing now present in their space or in their workflows.
I think it's
Um,
it's another really strong example of sort of values friction, because a lot of these for-profit vendors, and working in digital pedagogy, we have the same thing with ed tech tools. They
Absolutely.
put these things in as compelling selling points without really thinking about the underlying pedagogy, the underlying practices, the underlying ideologies of it. And I don't always know the answer, but it's the tools that are available to us. We don't necessarily need to use them the way that they've been marketed to us, I'd say, is sort of the approach that one could take if they don't have the power to kind of say, well, we're just not going to use this tool anymore, which most of us don't have that power.
Right. And, you know, for many of the librarians and library workers, we have sort of shared values of service and curiosity, and in many cases, innovation. And so this may be perhaps an opportunity for us in this space, to look at some of these integrations and really think about the potential and the perils simultaneously. So thank you so much for that perspective. I think we really appreciate that because it's certainly a challenge in our space. And to your point, in the larger educational technology space, but I know we are certainly feeling it quite prominently in the library sector. Um, so turning our attention at this point back to that larger higher education landscape, which we are part of in academic libraries. Within higher education, what are some of the ways that we could actually foster trust and transparency when guiding students and faculty in the ethical use of generative artificial intelligence tools for academic purposes?
I think really start by modeling. So being transparent ourselves about our own perspectives on generative AI, how they might have impacted our own adoption and practices, how we've thought about them. For example, when I deliver workshops about generative AI, I will introduce myself as techno-skeptical and as somebody who comes from a critical education or critical pedagogy background, which I probably should have done at the beginning of our conversation today, but there you have it. And this sort of helps anyone I'm talking to understand immediately where I'm speaking from, and they can choose how that will change how they're actually absorbing or engaging with the information that I'm sharing. But importantly, when I do provide my stance, I also frame it as a subjectivity rather than sort of a decree of ethical use. I don't try and tell everyone else this is the right way. I want to leave space for others to share their own stances. I want to invite their own transparency on what they're thinking about, how they're engaging with these tools, especially when their views differ from my own. I feel if we don't create this space where it's possible for people to have different perspectives, we might inadvertently create a reluctance for others to share or compel them to deliberately obscure how they are or not using these tools because they might feel like they'll be judged or they'll be shamed if it doesn't align with our own use. As an educator and sort of thinking about how we engage with students and others and model for them, I also think it's really clear to be, or it's really important to be clear about your expectations of use and how you expect others to sort of document and share whether or not they've used these tools. But not just by providing sort of the rules, but providing the rationale. So you probably shouldn't use Gen AI in this way for this task because it will result in learning loss, or because we really want you to demonstrate and develop the ability to do this task unaided. This level of transparency, this sort of rationale, can also help foster critical awareness required by everyone to make informed decisions that align with their own values. I also try and create space in these conversations by asking other folks to start, even before we start talking about what AI can and can't do or ethics, just start with what are your values? Like, what do you actually care about? And then how does all this other information about these tools align or conflict with that? Which I find can be a really valuable way to open up conversation with faculty, students, or really anyone because it allows them to reflect on sort of that core fundamental thing that drives their decision making. So another thing that I've been thinking about increasingly is normalizing changing our minds. Generative AI is emergent. Things are changing quickly. New information is becoming available all the time, which means that our practices and our perceptions should be changing too. But sometimes it can feel like once you've taken a position, either yay AI or anti AI, you're locked in. That's it. Again, this might be because of the potential feeling that you're going to be judged if suddenly you've pivoted or you are starting to think about things differently. For example, when I first started running AI programming, I would use a lot of AI generated images. I loved the ability to iteratively update the images to get exactly the aesthetic I was looking for. So this was many, many back and forth conversations with these tools. And at that time, I was really fixated on sort of the novel ability to do this, but I hadn't really considered the way that these tools are impacting artists. I wasn't really aware of how they were trained on stolen intellectual property. I wasn't deeply thinking about the environmental impact of this constant iteration. So now I still reuse the images that I've already generated, but I no longer create new images. I'm back to places like Unsplash and other online image banks. And being able to change my mind, my stance, and my opinion on this, I think is really important to allow us to respond to the changing narrative of AI and continually kind of engage in these dialogues with folks who have different perceptions than ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really helpful approach. We all reserve the right to change our mind and change our perspective as our interactions with AI tools and technologies naturally change and evolve over time. And that doing so is part of a critical and also a very human-centered perspective on these tools. Um, so I think that's a perfect transition to talking about another very human-centric aspect of working with these tools, which is really around emotional intelligence. So how can emotional intelligence, and in particular empathy and self-awareness, help library staff effectively support both students navigating confusion around generative AI tools and faculty who may feel resistant or anxious, many of the same feelings that the library workers and librarians might feel themselves, about integrating these technologies into their teaching and research?
I think that the emotional nature of these conversations doesn't get talked about enough, and we don't really recognize that this is such an important underlying factor in how we're talking to each other and how we're responding to AI. But it's rare for anyone to have like no emotional reaction to generative AI at all. It is an extremely disruptive force. It introduces uncertainty, it fosters distrust in others, whether or not they wrote this thing or are people using this for cheating or for nefarious purposes. It challenges human exceptionalism, this idea that suddenly this other entity can do some of the things that we thought we were only able to do. It can make us simultaneously feel a lack of control or agency because it's sort of being forced on us, while also empowering us to do things that we were possibly never able to do before. It appeals to the human sense of wonderment and imagination. And on top of all of this, we're living in this like media hype bubble about generative AI, which is deliberately designed to spark emotional reactions, either in favor of or against AI. The doom and gloom news cycles, as well as the positive narratives that generative AI is going to fix all human ails, kind of are constantly being put out there on social media. So all of this creates complex feelings. And I think the very first thing that anyone can do, library workers, educational developers, instructors, students, is to recognize and to name our own emotional reactions. This is the most important place to start because these will change constantly, but these will also change how we're engaging with other people and how we're engaging with these tools. We also need to give ourselves permission to feel our feelings genuinely and openly without being driven by them. So we don't want to react only to our feelings and let that be the only factor that that changes how we respond to these things. But we need to know that they're there, and they are one of the things that's going to impact how we're engaging in these conversations. I think we also need to create space for different opinions and different types of users and different perceptions, and recognize that many people will have very different feelings to our own. In my own work, I try asking questions rather than making firm statements about ethical use. I think demonstrating curiosity and a willingness to listen to others' perspectives is also really important. As I mentioned, generative AI is a very emergent social phenomenon. Because things are constantly changing, as much as we're positioned as teachers in this space or as like library assistants, as educators, we're actually all kind of in it together. We're all learning together. So we need to create space to learn from each other. Find out what is making folks anxious or excited or hesitant. Provide information where information gaps may exist that are fueling those feelings. But maybe don't try to change minds. I'm not sure that's really our job, is to say, well, no, your perception is wrong. You should really be thinking about it this way. Instead, it should be more, here's some more information that might inform how you're thinking about these things. At least this is how I like to think. I've been approaching it. But I will recognize that my approach is absolutely biased by my own techno-skepticism. The type of information I'm providing might sway someone in one direction rather than another. That's one of the reasons I actually developed the Domains of AI Awareness framework, and which underlies a lot of the programming that I lead, because it is an attempt to provide information to help folks build awareness and confidence to use or refuse generative AI in ways that make sense for them, creating space for them to have their own feelings about it.
Absolutely. And, this certainly relates back to the values conversation. And it certainly seems that while we're in this place where there's a lot of rapid change and a lot of mixed messaging, that really emphasizing places where we can make room and leave time and space for those human to human connections is probably our best approach moving forward. And I think certainly will be very compelling to many of the library workers out there who spend a lot of their time talking with students and faculty, and really interacting with other members of their university communities. So, this is potentially really a very viable path forward for us. We can feel our feelings, we can name those feelings, we can identify those values. And that can potentially be a place where we can make a significant contribution. But from that, building from that last question, particularly, are there certain or particular strategy that academic libraries as organizations that are trusted sources of information in the higher education environment could consider or implement to create emotionally supportive environments for discussing the ethical, pedagogical, and practical implications of generative AI? In other words, how could we actively support this from the academic library organization?
So I don't know if this is too simple an answer, but I think libraries need to keep doing what you're doing. I view libraries as places of radical thinking and resistance, but also places of multiplicity where many different people with wildly different beliefs and perspectives can come together to seek information. And that's exactly what needs to happen here, and the type of support that needs to help shape these conversations. Libraries are able and are very well positioned to foster AI awareness by providing the whole story rather than favoring one particular perspective or one narrative in favor of sort of one institutional goal. Libraries are places that teach information literacy, which I think is really the key here. People talk about AI literacy, but really it all boils down to information literacy. But part of it may also be in that space, in that sort of support, acknowledging the emotional labor of navigating the information landscape, of engaging with these tools, of engaging with others about these tools, allowing people to show up and ask questions about how to use these tools without the fear of judgment for whatever their stance may be. I also firmly believe that academic libraries can be places of advocacy, pushing back against uninformed adoption or uninformed resistance, either at the individual level or at the institutional level. They're a place that I think there's a lot of power to weigh in on institutional policies, give them sort of that information, provide, I guess, maybe at the institutional level, that same information literacy, and help challenge the pervasive narratives that all adoption of AI is good or inevitable. I firmly believe that more than anything, this conversation needs nuance. And I believe that libraries are a place where nuance can and does exist, and can very much support that necessary part of the complexity of the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that really inspirational conclusion, Dani. We appreciate it, and I love seeing your perspective as somebody who works in the higher education space as a colleague, but doesn't work in the academic library space. And I certainly hope for all of the librarians and library workers out there listening, that you see the possibility of so many of our partners across the higher education space to really give us opportunity to bring that perspective and that critical expertise on information and information literacy into these conversations around artificial intelligence. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today, Dani. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you. And some information will be coming up on the screen in just a couple of minutes, and folks are certainly welcome and encouraged to register for our upcoming community conversations where we'll be discussing the readings and this conversation in a little bit more depth collectively, helping to create space for some of that human to human connection. And I would certainly welcome everybody to register, but also Dani is going to be joining us for our November community discussions. So we're very excited to welcome her, and we look forward to seeing you there.